Star Wars fans have been pretty spoiled when it comes to games based off their favorite franchise. In fact, spoiled might be an understatement. Over the last 40 years, there have been over 100 Star Wars games released, spanning almost every genre imaginable. I mean hell, there were even entire games solely dedicated to building droids and the art of pod racing. And while the sheer amount of titles means there's been a fair amount of clunkers, the franchise actually has a pretty good batting average, and has even spawned its share of undisputed classics that casual fans like myself can appreciate. And when you're talking about classic Star Wars games, you can't forget to mention the Knights of the Old Republic series. Now, most people usually consider BioWare's original to be the stronger of the two, but personally speaking, I've always preferred its sequel. Developed by Obsidian Entertainment, the Sith Lords was given the impossible task of following up what was at the time universally considered to be the definitive Star Wars game. To make matters worse, while BioWare had over 3 years to work on and refine the first game, Obsidian was only given a little over 13 months to develop the sequel, as LucasArts wanted it on shelves in time for the holiday season, and that rushed development cycle is felt in the final product. In terms of graphics and gameplay, the Sith Lords didn't boast the types of enhancements you'd expect from a big-name sequel. If you haven't played these games and you were to compare two screenshots of them side by side, I imagine it'd be pretty impossible to tell them apart, and it certainly doesn't help that two of the planets you visit here are pulled directly from the first game. And despite being a big fan of the Sith Lords, I can't deny that the whole experience does feel a little undercooked in some aspects. Not only was it pretty buggy, but a couple of plot points were also introduced, only to be dropped without any resolution. There was the infamous HK manufacturing plant that's alluded to on multiple occasions, but never actually makes an appearance, and at least one side quest that simply can't be finished, so anybody with a bad case of OCD may want to stay away. And yet, despite all those issues, I keep coming back to the Sith Lords time and time again, because at its core, this is an incredibly ambitious and fantastic role-playing experience that offers what's possibly the most complex and mature story the franchise has ever produced. While the movies might sport PG-13 ratings these days, the franchise has always prided itself on being a family-friendly experience. Dating back to the first films, these have always been fairy tales about noble heroes overcoming the corrupt forces of evil, and even though there are a lot of battles, most of the time the movies gloss over the true horrors of war. Like I said, most of the time. The Sith Lords was different. You played as a Jedi exile who followed Revan and Malak into the Mandalorian Wars against the wishes of the Jedi Council. Due to all the death and destruction they witnessed and had a hand in causing, the exile lost their connection to the Force. While it might have been filtered through Star Wars terms, it's all obviously a metaphor for PTSD. Driving the point home even further is the fact that our protagonists chose to spend their exile in solitude, cutting off all ties with others. And when it first came out, we really hadn't seen anything like this in Star Wars before. I mean, you'd never guess that Luke had a body count that would make Oppenheimer blush based on his demeanor throughout the first 3 movies, but Obsidian didn't shy away from showing the full impact that war has on its participants. Good people are often forced into doing terrible things during times of war, and a light side playthrough of the Sith Lords is the story of a war veteran who's able to come to grips with their actions and come to peace with their past. Conversely, this is one of the few games I've played where you're kinda sorta justified for being an evil dickhead. The Exile was the only Jedi who followed Revan and Malak who didn't fall to the dark side, instead returning to the Council to face judgment and get some answers to their current predicament. But instead of trying to find out why the Exile did what they did or why they've returned, the Council is quick to villainize and cast them out, leading the Exile to believe that being cut off from the Force was part of their punishment. And it's not hard to see why that could lead to some resentment over the years. One of my favorite things about the Sith Lords was the way it sought to humanize the Jedi, instead of portraying them as the flawless paragons of virtue that they're so often depicted as. Now, to its credit, this is something that George Lucas did try to explore a little bit in the prequels, but, and this is probably the only time in history that somebody will ever say this, he may have been too subtle. Like, yeah, Anakin's first meeting with the Jedi Council literally has him going to meet them in their ivory tower so they can cast judgment on him, but Palpatine spends the following 2 movies being so cartoonishly evil and manipulative that it overshadows all that. The Sith Lords, on the other hand, puts their flaws on full display and didn't shy away from shining light on the arrogance and downright hypocrisy of the Jedi Code. It poses questions that hadn't really been asked in Star Wars before, such as how much the Jedi Masters are to blame when one of their students falls to the dark side, and even makes the point that to the average citizen of the Republic, there really isn't all that much of a difference between the Jedi and the Sith. You typically don't go into a Star Wars game expecting to engage in philosophical debates about the necessity of war or the pros and cons of charity, but you can in the Sith Lords. The writing in this game is just top-notch, resulting in some of the most unique and memorable characters in the franchise's nearly 50-year history. Kreia gets most of the praise, and rightly so. In a game full of morally dubious characters, she proves to be the most complex of them all, acting as the ultimate opportunist, manipulating events from the shadows with her true goals remaining unclear until the final act of the game.
I'm playing both sides so that I always come out on top.
She's also the catalyst for many of the game's most interesting debates and discussions, and as a result, she gets a lot of the best lines. Her voice actor, Sarah Kesselman, just absolutely owned the role and completely made it her own, delivering what I consider to be one of the best performances in all of Star Wars. And it makes perfect sense when you realize she already had a distinguished 50-year career by the time of the Sith Lords. The rest of the cast shouldn't be slept on though. Atton's always been one of my favorites. Not only does he fill the Han Solo role of the wisecracking smuggler who's always got a blaster and one-liner at the ready, but it also turns out he has an extremely tragic backstory and proves to be a far more complicated figure than he appears at first glance. Mira is a lovable bounty hunter who refuses to kill her targets and was an orphan of the Mandalorian Wars, while Visas was corrupted by the Sith Lord Nihilus after he caused the destruction of her home planet. And if you were a fan of the first game, then you were no doubt happy to see the return of Candris Ordo, now going by Mandalore, and the assassin droid HK-47, who wastes no time reminding everybody why he's easily the most hilarious character to ever come out of Star Wars. Although to be fair, some of the snarky responses you're able to choose from as the Exile do give him a run for his money. The only party member who I don't really care for is Goto, now a shady businessman who cares nothing about the squabbles between the Jedi and the Sith, and only wishes to see order restored to the galaxy in order to further his own self-interest. Is interesting on paper, but I have to admit I never actually use the guy. Let's be honest, when you want a droid in your party, you're gonna go with HK-47 every single time.
Master, this is one of those rare times when you make my behavioral module glow.
And while she might not get a ton of screen time, I've always had a big soft spot for Atris and her complicated past with a male exile. The way her unspoken love was twisted into feelings of jealousy, contempt, and ultimately hatred over the years feels extremely realistic and adult in a way that most video game relationships can't come close to. And in my opinion, the Star Wars universe has never felt as fully realized as it does here in the Sith Lords. BioWare and Obsidian weren't shy about drawing from other sources in the expanded universe, and while I might not geek out over mentions of Exar Kun or Frida Nad like a hardcore fan would, I can still appreciate how these little touches give the Star Wars galaxy a sense of history that's often lacking in the films. Oh yeah, and in addition to providing a unique twist on the standard Star Wars formula, the Sith Lords also finds time to be a pretty damn good RPG. The power curve of going from wimpy exile to a full-fledged master of the Force is just as satisfying as it was in the first game, and you even start off as a Jedi, which removes one of the major complaints a lot of people had with its predecessor. While I never minded it, I do know it was pretty common practice for a lot of players to avoid leveling up until they hit Dantooine in order to min-max, but I will say that having some Force powers to play with does make combat in the early game much less of a slog. A number of your non-Jedi party members in the Sith Lords are also revealed to be Force sensitives, and by gaining or losing enough influence with them, you can take them on as an apprentice. Now, one of my biggest issues with the first game was that there was pretty much no reason not to have a party full of Jedi at almost all times. As much as I loved a mission in Zalbar, it was hard to justify bringing them along over Bastila Jolie when Jedi were just so OP. So having a way to convert many of my favorite companions into Jedi and having it tie into learning more about their various backstories is a major win in my book. Now, when it comes to the actual combat, as I alluded to earlier, things haven't really changed all that much from the first game. Yeah, it includes a few new powers and abilities, but there's nothing earth-shattering added in. The most notable addition is probably the various lightsaber forms that all have their own benefits and drawbacks, but assuming you've been leveling up your squad properly, you can completely ignore them and it won't make much of a difference, even on the highest difficulty. So the blend of traditional turn-based and real-time combat that BioWare had come up with for the first game might not have evolved all that much, but honestly, I didn't mind when I first played the Sith Lords, and it still doesn't bother me now. It's pretty much a prototype to the tactic system in Dragon Age, where you can assign each member of your party a behavior so that they automatically use the appropriate weapons, power, and items, but you're still free to step in and give everybody individual commands whenever you see fit. I mean, obviously, if you're somebody who just hates traditional role-playing games, then yeah, I think it's safe to say you can skip out on the Sith Lords, but as long as you've got some appreciation for the genre, then I can't imagine there being too much to complain about when it comes to the actual moment-to-moment gameplay. And as RPG fans know, it usually isn't the gameplay that sets apart the greatest role-playing games. Having a hand in defining your character and seeing how the game reacts to your various choices across multiple playthroughs is a large part of the appeal for many players, and those people won't be disappointed here. While dumping points into Persuade is the best way to guarantee you have the most dialogue options available to you at any given time, other stats and attributes like awareness, wisdom, and intelligence often provide you with unique choices as well, further increasing the role-playing opportunities. There are even a few times where having a combat ability can pay off, such as during the showdown between Baklu's and Talia's forces on Onderon, when you're able to use battle meditation to rally the troops before you join in the fight. Seeing how the other half lives and swapping genders doesn't just result in small changes to dialogue and swap around your romantic options either. Whether or not the handmaiden or the disciple joins your party is completely dependent on whether you play as a male or female exile. The game even found an ingenious solution to the classic RPG problem by letting you dictate which of the endings for the first game is canon during each of your playthroughs during an early conversation with Adden. Now, I know a lot of people consider Fallout New Vegas to be Obsidian's best game, as well as one of the best role-playing games ever made, but the Sith Lords was the first opportunity the studio had to prove themselves, and it's obvious they didn't intend to waste it. So where many people look at the bugs in the cut content and end up disappointed, I can't help but see them as a testament to the developer's ambition. Given the accelerated development cycle and the fact that it was the studio's first game, it would have been hard to blame Obsidian too much if they decided to play it safe and intentionally scale things down. Instead, even with all the constraints imposed on them, they still managed to find their own way to attempt to deliver the definitive Star Wars experience. Now, were they able to fully deliver on all their ideas? No, but I'd rather a team shoot for the moon and come up short rather than simply coast, and the one thing you can't accuse the Sith Lords of is a lack of ambition. And if you need any more proof of just how much this game has resonated with some people, then just look into the Restored Content mod. A dedicated group of fans have spent nearly 20 years fixing many of the game's bugs and even restoring some of the cut content. Think about that. People have spent almost 2 decades working on this game for free in an attempt to bring it more in line with Obsidian's original vision. You don't do that unless there's something truly special about a game. And special is the perfect word to describe the Sith Lords. Even after all this time, there really hasn't been another major Star Wars project that's been as effective at tackling such mature themes or casting that galaxy far, far away in such a dark and downright sinister light, allowing the Sith Lords to occupy a unique space within the Star Wars landscape. Whether you're a longtime fan looking for a new spin on the universe you know and love, or even somebody with no interest in Star Wars who's just looking for a good RPG to sink your teeth into, I can't recommend this game enough. I give Star Wars Knights of the Old Republic 2, The Sith Lords, 11.5 perfectly placed blaster shots
against statistically long odds
out of 12. What is up, people? Dusty here, and I hope you enjoyed this video, especially if you're still watching at this point. Leave a comment down below to let me know what you think, and consider subscribing to the channel. And as always, thanks for watching.